Greetings, St. Andrew students. Today on the WPC podcast, we bring you a special edition of the show featuring different types of COVID-19 tests, how they work, and which work the most effectively. The test that you are probably most familiar with is the PCR, or the polymerase chain reaction test, also known as the molecular test. It is the current status quo for the highest quality of COVID tests. The first thing for this test is the collection of the sample. That happens when a swab is collected from your nose. If you've ever had a COVID test before, you probably know what this feels like. The swab essentially goes into your nose and deep into it, and they move it around so they could get a lot of things attached onto it, and hopefully, among the things attached onto it is a viral RNA of COVID-19. The sample is then sort of reduced. There's other things in the sample, such as proteins and fats, but these are removed through enzymes and chemicals and filtering so that only the RNA is preserved. When the RNA is acquired, it undergoes a process called reverse transcription, which turns it from an RNA into a DNA, a deoxyribonucleic acid. After that, the DNA is exposed to COVID-19 specific primers, which are basically small strands of nucleic acid that binds to specific parts of the DNA, and it tells the DNA where it is supposed to copy. And if there is a viral DNA, then it will be copied and amplified. And after it has been copied and amplified, when the scientists look at it and analyze it, if they see COVID-19 DNA, then it means that you have COVID-19. This type of COVID test is the most sensitive out of them because PCR is able to take very small amounts of RNA and then through the polymerase chain reaction, turn it into a lot of DNA. So it is the most effective test in terms of testing for the virus and is very useful in the clinical setting. However, the problem with this type of test is that it often takes a very long time, such as up to two days or even more to get the results back. So the problem with this test is that because it takes so long and requires such delicate and specific instruments, it's very expensive and not well suited for screening a lot of people. So although it's very accurate, it's very difficult to scale up, and in a large pandemic, it is just impractical to sort of screen lots of people. All right, now Alfred will talk to you about rapid antigen tests.
So as Jason stated, the next and probably most common type of test aside from PCR is the rapid antigen test. So to explain what this is, we first need to know what an antigen is. So an antigen in this context are the proteins that are part of the COVID-19 virus. A rapid antigen test, just like PCR, takes a swab from your nose, but instead of testing for the genetic material of the virus, the RNA, it detects only for the proteins that come from the virus, which are the antigens. This type of test is cheaper and it yields fast results, as fast as 15 minutes. And it is sensitive when the patient is most infectious, which for the purposes of mass testing is good. However, it is not as effective as PCR and has higher rates of false negative, and is also less effective when you've had COVID for a prolonged period of time. Compared to PCR, the rapid antigen test is better in the sense that it's cheaper and faster, so it's typically better for mass testing of a population. The final test we'll be talking about today is the antibody test. This type of test is different from the rest in the sense that it only works after you've had the virus. This is because the antibody test relies on your body to create antibodies, which are the proteins that bind to the virus's antigens and fight them off when they enter your body. So instead of taking a nose swab, an antibody test actually takes a blood sample. So once the sample is collected, COVID-19 antigens are mixed with the blood, and if the blood indeed does have the COVID-19 specific antibodies, the two will bind and result in a color change, which indicates that the person did previously have the virus. Compared to PCR and rapid antigen, this type of test is not as useful in a practical sense in terms of testing an entire population, but it is useful if you want to find out if you previously had COVID-19.
All right, so um, those are the different ways that we currently test for COVID, and I think at least in Canada, the best test would be the rapid antigen test, since it covers enough people, it's cheap, it's effective, and although it's less accurate than the PCR test, just the sheer volume of tests you could do in comparison to the PCR test makes that well worth it. And all right, and that was the podcast. I am Jason Zhang, and thank you so
And
much
I
for
am Alfred
listening. The
Kwan.
sources will be
Thank you for
linked down
listening.
below.